Good evening, everybody, and I want to say thank everyone for coming out this evening. We did have beautiful weather today, but it is still winter, and it's really great to see so many people out here and obviously excited and interested. On behalf of the Committee on Creative Writing, undergraduate program, the Chicago Studies program, and the Smart Museum of Art, where we're sitting, I'm pleased to welcome you to the reading and reception for the Heart of Chicago Writing Contest. With your indulgence, I'm going to read a little bit myself, not of things that I've written. So here goes. The heart of Chicago is that portion of the city area between Halsted Street and the lake, and between the main river and 12th Street, now Roosevelt Road. The treatment of this area involves the most serious problems encountered in the plan of the city. All that is necessary is to take advantage of existing possibilities by combining the various elements into a consistent whole. By doing so, a unified city, wherein each portion will have organic relation to all other portions, will result. That's from the Plan of Chicago by Daniel Burnham. It's the beginning of Chapter 7, which was written in 1909. By nights, when the yellow salamanders of the L bend all one way and the cold rain runs with red-lit rain, by the way the city's million wires are burned only by lightest snow, when chairs are stacked and glasses are turned and arc lamps are all dimmed, by days when the wind bangs alley gates ajar and the sun goes on by the wind, by nights when the moon is an only child above the measured thunder of the cars, you may know Chicago's heart at last. Which is from a prose poem called Chicago City on the Make by Nelson Algren, who was born in 1909. And that sort of coincidence was the genesis, at least in my head, of this writing contest. So I wanted to sort of introduce that to you, along with the inspiration that is here in the Smart Museum in the form of the Heartland exhibit. The two very different hearts of Chicago, Burnham's and Algren's, alongside the works in this exhibit, have served as some inspiration for the writers. To get started, I want to thank a number of people. First of all, again, thank you all for coming out this evening. Again, fabulous and wonderful that there are so many folks who are interested in writing and in the city. I want to thank all of the contributors to the contest itself, especially for what you did in terms of making this very difficult decision for the judges. I want to thank the judges themselves, Srikanth Reddy, assistant professor in the Department of English and Creative Writing, who judged the poetry portion, and Garen Sickle, lecturer in creative writing, who judged the prose portion. Thanks to our partners, the Smart Museum of Art and the Chicago Media Initiatives Group, taping in the background, for both their support in this contest and the Heart of Chicago video contest, which happened earlier this year. And special thanks at the Smart to Christy Peterson for her support and for tolerating my crazy off-the-wall ideas that end up in receptions like this. I want to thank Professor Janice Knight of the English Department and the Committee on Creative Writing, especially in a meeting of the College Council. She challenged the Chicago Studies program to think broader than the social sciences and to figure out how we can include more and more of the humanities. So this is a result of that question in some ways. And thank you especially to Kate Soto of the Creative Writing Program, who's here tonight, sitting over there. She doesn't like being pointed out, but she's the person who put all of the work into this. What I like to say is that anything that happens tonight that goes well is to her credit, and anything that goes wrong is my fault. And I want to beg your indulgence again as I read another selection from a great Chicago writer, Ben Hecht. This is from a book of newspaper articles, if you can believe it, that he wrote for the Chicago Daily News in the early part of the 1920s. And this is from an article called Ornaments. The book is 1001 Afternoons in Chicago. I highly recommend it. It's amazing and beautiful. Today, the city frowns from one end to the other like a highly efficient and insanely practical platitude. Mood has given way to mode. An essential evolution, alas. D'Artagnan wore his Paris as a cloak, and perhaps Mr. Insel wears his Chicago as a shirt front, but most of us have parted company with the town. It is a background designed and marvelously executed for our conveniences. The great metronomes of the Loop with their million windows, the deft crisscross of streets, the utilitarian miracles of plumbing, doorways, heating systems, and passenger carriers. These are monuments to our collective sanity. But if one is insane, if one has inherited one's grandfather's characteristics as idler, loafer, what then? One stays at home and tells it to the typewriter. Or more likely, one gets run down, chewed up, and bespattered while darting across State Street in quest of an invigorating vanilla phosphate. I think you'll hear in the upcoming readings that the students who represent the winners of this contest, while they were telling it to their typewriters, have successfully navigated State Street and are, I hope, enjoying their vanilla phosphates. With that, I want to introduce the winners of the Heart of Chicago Writing Contest. And for those of you that have a program, which I managed to leave not here, we're going to start with the poetry, going with the runners-up, sort of up the poetry section, and then go down to the prose. So the runner-up in the poetry section of the contest, I'm pleased to introduce, is Matthew Lemoyne, class of 2010. He'll be reading Night Move, Chicago Song.
This poem is called Night Move, Chicago Song. Thanks for coming, BT Dubs. Night Move. Like any visitor, I didn't come here for a home, nor did Chicago feel like home at first. Its painted streets and thrust, lofty cornices left a burning in my cheeks. My feet hankered for familiar streets like leaves in green, shameless thirst need light. Home was far from this limbo. I left the night that grass-downed hills rippled like muscles from holding me to keep familiar feelings close and safe. August leaves appeals are too intimate to recount. Within months, I'd left them in a kicked silver dust. 1 year later, stars are scarce, and I'm just beginning to understand the way night feels without their reminders. My shy skin flinches still when jostled wayward by some stranger crossing the street, eyes like sky steel. None of anything here is familiar yet, except blessedly familiar acts of understanding. I hopped a bus packed front to rear, was forced to grip the steel by a young woman. Careening in night, I apologized for the pair we'd become, rubbing closely. She said, "Don't worry." In another year or two, I might begin to see the city as a familiar field of concerned, strong shoulders. I might become a source of help for visitors, like rust is for destruction. Or cutting through night without looking, I'll know why tourists eye steel skies. God damn the day that happens. New steel is good steel. Even so, the golden lights in westward stretching lines caress the night in ways I wish I could, with moves familiar, whispering in tones more hushed than rust, softer than the citizen I will become. The day your steel feels familiar, city, thrust me into learning your rust as well, and only then, by night or light, may I come to call you home. Thanks.
Before I introduce the next reader, I actually want to give Matthew credit. I intended to read folks' bios, and so here's Matthew Lemoyne's bio, class of 2010. Matthew Lemoyne is a fourth-year English major in the college. He is originally from, Dover, New Hampshire, and his interests include theoretical physics, casual billiards, and making sweet, sweet music. So thank you, Matthew. Now it's my pleasure to introduce the first of our first prize winners. We actually had a tie. Who's Saul Lee from the class of 2011, and if Saul can start his way up here while I read his bio, that would be good. Saul Lee is currently a third-year fundamentals major. I actually haven't asked him his question yet, but maybe you guys can do that later. His hometown is Las Vegas, Nevada. There he grew up, was educated, and fell in love with food, met God, picked up street dance, got his first kiss in car, and overcame his video game addiction. Here in Chicago, he mostly occupies himself with his coursework, job at the CPO, and role in InterVarsity. But he also likes to write, go to concerts, eat cheap, for example, Harold's, and meet new people. He plans to eat out sometime tonight, graduate sometime later, and travel a lot after that. Saul Lee reading When Harold's and When I Think of Chicago, I Think.
Hi guys. I'm really loud, so I'm gonna test if you guys can hear me in the back without the mic, because it creates weird reverb. Can you hear me? Yes. Okay. So I'm gonna do this. And as was mentioned, this first poem is gonna be about Harold's chicken. When Harold's on it, hot sauce effervesces like joy fizzing and enters the slipstream, enters my nostrils, enters my brain and fills my eyeballs and temples, now tingling, sharp sensations, fizzing joy. I swoon for aroma. Aroma enters my bloodstream and sets to dancing all my nerve endings. I tingle all over, deaf and numb. As on I gaze, feeling like a funny bone or a funny skeleton. Harold's chicken. Liquid chicken. The chicken fryer did well to preserve its chicken sanctity, did well to protect its lickin' goodness. With the holy guard, the crumbly, scrumptious army of chicken skin fry, succumb I to its highness, and ever so gently, nay, reverently. As for the gods of Hellas, I break through the skin fry front with tongue poised lovingly to undress it in one slow sweep, my enamel enamored of lickin' chicken. This one's a little random. When I think of Chicago, I think, one, of a dog and a bicyclist who looks like a dog on a bicycle, huffing him or herself down Lakeshore Drive, while the other two pretend it isn't strange, and you do too. Two, I also think of a sausage named Maxwell. He's Polish, high five. Which makes him different from beef, who is not Polish, but Italian, like ice is. I don't know who gave these respectable people such god-awful names, or what numbnuts named every other building around here Henry Crown or Regenstein, except Willis Tower, thank John Hancock. 3, I'm told I'm supposed to think of corruption, but you know what? When I'm downtown, I see these whitewashed edifices so regal and beautiful, protected by pure and whitewashed platoons of real nice-seeming policemen, cavalry policemen, believe you me, on real-life ponies. Ponies don't exist in the desert where I'm from. They're like unicorns. Yes, that was supposed to distract you from the fact that they paid me to mention corruption in this contest. I guess it didn't work. For I think foggily of an important city with important dates of publications, of public scandals, of pubs being outlawed, of grime and jazz, and most importantly of Harry and Sally, kind of. An important city with important places of historical interest, academic, musical, comedic, sophistic, meteorological, culinary, Olympic, international, monetary interest. Not to mention Chicago's hinterlands, think Aurora, after which the Borealis is named. With important figures of both the already and the soon-to-be historical types like Daly and Daly, respectively, along with the self-proclaimed type, like that preacher guy over there, and my type, immigrant. 5, you know, You know, I migrated here on foot with just a few prickly pears to sustain me from some dinky desert elsewhere, where not everything seems important like it does here. Like that dog person, like that fat man's horse, like that building over there. I like that building, but I don't think that building likes me. At least Mr. T pities me. He counsels me in dreams. He tells me I don't love Chicago if I don't pity Chicago. And I understand finally that building is lonely. Thank you.
Thank you, Saul. Next up, we have the other first prize for poetry, won by Sasha Geffen. Sasha is from Boston and loves cities. Lately, she's been set designing for University Theater and reviewing music for Performer magazine. She would like to thank you for coming.
This is called Cyclists Pursue the Horizon. I shamelessly stole that from Stephen Crane, but it's all right. We built this city for giants because one day giants will walk its streets, the sidewalks could scream. The city quivers as a body, guitarists growling at the underbelly, rabbit writers gnawing at its paws. Jeff Tweedy is no longer a poet, but left that torch burning underneath the State Street Bridge for anyone who could lift that melancholy. Look at the towers, there's nothing more lonely. Cobbled monoliths aching black against the orange haze. Each cell glows weakly. But each groove of the Aeon Center is a middle finger, an acrophobic fuck you, an anti-gravity manifesto. After all, we're not so small. Think of book pages swirling in the wind. Defy, defy. The wind scrapes its teeth across my open hands. It doesn't matter which block you turn down, the wind either follows you or blows from all directions at once. We built this city to live where it is too cold to live. This cold is no New England cold, which hangs crystalline in the deep green air. The city reels with its own cold, chemical cold, cold that reaches forceps down the throat and twists shut the windpipe. That is why our bookstores build bonfires. That is why we bite back. The grit, the tar drips, the nicotine glues the pavement together. That is why we clasp jaws with a cold that coughs in our mouths. In a city built from fire, we find ourselves embers, the orange haze, the second star, wet faces spitting against the dark. The city wraps its winter sun in steel wool. Look at the sky. Listen. The loop pumps its thunder away. The dark apartment windows flashing back the blue sparks. The cat has died. The cremator's charge. We have matches and a yard. The city that can't sleep. The L rumbles out its insomniac odes. The punk bands that scream in secret basements cram shivering steel flames in your ears. The loudest amps, a block-wide earthquake. Motherfucker, give me a quarter for the bus. Cigarette smoke rise in the neon. Here beneath the L's rusted archways, the taxis pulse home. Defy. A bicyclist racing the night. Defy. You'll hit the lake before you hit the dawn. Odds of 10 million to 1. Through a winter spent embering, you learn. The ancient fire, the will to burn. Thank you.
Thank you, Sasha. So we now move into the prose category, and the runner-up for Heart of Chicago Writing Contest in the prose category is James Santel. James Santel is a second year in the college, likely majoring in English. He graduated from an all-boys Jesuit high school, St. Louis University High, in 2008. James will be reading from his essay, North to Chicago.
So this is an essay I wrote called North to Chicago. I've condensed it a little bit. But St. Louisans view Chicago the way 18th century Muscovites considered St. Petersburg, as an upstart city, perhaps culturally richer, but lacking in natural integrity. St. Louisans are happy to visit Chicago for a weekend, but behind our enjoyment lurks the knowledge that the Windy City grew fat on St. Louis's decline. Crippled by a city-county split and having failed to capitalize on the railroad boom, St. Louis faded into obsolescence as Chicago became the jewel of the Midwest. Even without knowing the particulars of this history, the St. Louisan visiting Chicago feels in the city's impeccable design the sorrow of what might have been. Regret is in our DNA as a city. It is the main component of the great St. Louis inferiority complex. The St. Louisan's ambivalence towards Chicago was apparent in my college search 2 years ago. My top choices were Columbia and this institution. Telling people I was interested in the former school elicited responses of, wow, New York, that's pretty far away. Telling them I was interested in the U of C, on the other hand, earned something along the lines of, oh, Chicago, what a great city, followed by that wan smile that comes to St. Louisans' faces when they talk about Chicago's greatness, and which says all there is to say about what might have been. New York has a comparably weak effect on St. Louisans, not because we are hayseeds, but rather because we are pragmatists. No one thinks St. Louis could have been anything like New York, capital city for a nation of dreamers. But to be something like Chicago, a great Midwestern city founded on labor and industry, that was a distinct possibility, even for an all too brief period at the turn of the century, a reality. Outwardly, St. Louisans may seem more comfortable with their children studying in Chicago. We aren't traditionally a people that stray far from home. But to go to Chicago is to imply that you prefer what might have been. And St. Louisans, while too polite to condemn such a choice, are also still too hurt, consciously or not, to be entirely comfortable with it. Chicago is a 6-hour car ride from St. Louis, and like most other St. Louisans, I had spent my share of long weekends there by the time college began. Yet in all those visits, I never strayed far from Michigan Avenue. I never got a sense of the city's sprawl until I began school here at the University of Chicago, which I chose after Columbia rejected me. The Chicago that I knew was Daniel Burnham's Chicago, the immaculately planned downtown, dense with gleaming skyscrapers of obsidian black, the lakefront paths draped between land and water, the museums and parks and fountains and sculptures punctuating the whole grid, resulting in that uniquely Chicago achievement of beauty and efficiency. If this is the only part of Chicago you see, then you only know the city as a sublimely planned monument to the rewards Midwestern toil can reap, to beauty born of sweat. I hesitate to say that this notion of Chicago is of a city that is all heart, but at least it is of a city that is all muscle, tangible, taut, and poised for the next labor. But leaving Burnham's realm atrophied that muscle for me. Downtown came to seem like a front, designed to stress the type of tight municipal control upon which Chicago's democratic machine prides itself. Venturing into new neighborhoods made downtown appear less like the city's heart and more like a provincial capital feigning sovereignty over unruly fiefdoms. Scholarly Hyde Park, luminously shabby Pilsen, gentrified Wicker Park, each district sported unique architectures, peoples, patterns of light and shade, all grown from below rather than mandated from above. And in this spontaneity lay an affront to the carefully planned downtown that symbolizes Chicago to the world. I found Chicago to be decentralized and sporadic, its vitality coming from unknown sources, and I began to feel the same way. At the time of my transition to college, I wanted a sort of Burnham plan for my own life, but instead, neighborhoods of my existence began asserting themselves in disconcerting ways. In November, my father lost his job of 25 years, leaving him feeling adrift. My mom felt similarly about becoming an empty nester. With graduation looming in May, my sister was fretting over what to do after college, and I entered the U of C warily. My old boys' Jesuit high school had provided a comforting sense of order, and now I was feeling exposed and ill-equipped to deal with all of these transitions. As I struggled that autumn to grasp Chicago's center, as I gradually came to see it as a whirl of urbanity swirling off into meaningless expanses, I began to resent the second city. Still disappointed that I hadn't been able to study in New York, I was quickly becoming another St. Louisan for whom Chicago was a rueful reminder of the way things might have turned out. Then came my grandfather's stroke. My father's father had been diagnosed with Alzheimer's years earlier and had previously endured one minor stroke. But he weathered these troubles with the unassuming humor that had defined his whole life. The disease gnawed away at the edge of his personality, making him more childlike, but it never fully reached his core. The Grandpa Wally that I knew was largely intact. But now he was pushing 90, and when my dad told me the news by phone in January, not long after my return from Christmas break, he indicated that this stroke would change things. Change, of course, was not what I was equipped to deal with at the moment, but more change is what came. As if tuned to my grandfather by some marital seismograph, my grandmother's health nosedived shortly after his stroke, and we were forced to move both of them from their apartment to a nursing home. The quality of life in a nursing home is unimaginably low, and I often found myself walking across campus feeling guilty because activities that seemed like a chore to me, going to class or walking to the pharmacy, would have given my grandparents unspeakable joy. I'd been warned by an English teacher in high school to accept college for what it was and not to try and force it to be a repeat of high school. But after Grandpa's stroke, I found it increasingly difficult to believe that all of the changes befalling my life weren't part of a larger disease, and I began to identify Chicago as the source of my infection. One of the remarkable things about Chicago is that for all its sprawl, there is usually at least one point in each neighborhood from which you can see downtown looming beyond. Each of these points awakens in me a latent awe, as I imagine settlers might have felt viewing a city from across a plain. But for all its majesty and solidity, there is something unreal about thus viewing the ostensible heart of Chicago. Perhaps it is the oft-present veil of fog. Perhaps it is the Navy Pier Ferris wheel that, appended so bizarrely to the towering skyline, seems there only by the whimsy of some stage designer who looms unseen over the city, the moon merely the spotlight in his warehouse. Whatever the cause, it's difficult to comprehend that one is seeing from the outside what one experiences so totally from within. The Michigan Avenue Bridge, the Marina Towers, the late afternoon autumn shadows that stretch between the buildings, can these all be contained in that great totality seen from without? And when one is in the loop, it's equally difficult to understand that a quiet neighborhood like Hyde Park can exist in the same city as this roiling downtown. I came to feel that to find the heart of Chicago, one must be able to be everywhere at once, to be simultaneously on a silent corner of Lincoln Park as a mother pushes a stroller past, on Michigan Avenue watching crowds crane their necks at the Tribune Tower, and on an L as it races through the decrepit South Side. The cities I had spent the most time in before college, Boston, San Francisco, and St. Louis, were compact enough that their borders encompassed their essences and nothing more. This is true in the former two cities by virtue of them being at bottom large commercial towns, and in St. Louis by necessity. One can't help walk anywhere in Boston, say, and feel that each tree, each shadow, the way people tie their scarves and carry their coffee is wholly Bostonian. Not so in Chicago. One feels the city is always eluding him, sliding around the next corner like an L train. Imagine holding onto a long pole, the other end of which someone else is holding. You long to shake hands with this person, but neither of you are allowed to let go of your end of the pole. So no matter how you maneuver, you are always diametrically opposed to him whom you would touch. Chicago is this fleeting person. The vast simultaneity of human life, which Whitman and Tolstoy are so celebrated for portraying, is as much a source of vexation as it is of energy, for we cannot comprehend all happenings at once. This, I think, is why we are so hungry for any tidbit about the banal aspects of celebrities' lives. It is also why we fear absence from those we love. For our limited view of the world, the fact that we can only know one place at a time is not unlike our inability to know what lies beyond death. We crave total knowledge. We want to know where lies the heart of things. By spring, I was finished with Chicago, except for one incident. I traveled to Boston in June for my sister's graduation, another change that was producing anxiety in my family. Upon my return to Chicago on Monday, I hopped on the Blue Line from O'Hare for the long trip back to Hyde Park. But upon arriving in the Loop, I'd had enough of traveling underground, so I exited at State Street to find a number 6 bus on which I could at least enjoy the sunshine. Emerging from the station tired and haggard, I realized I hadn't yet been downtown during a weekday. Instead of weekend shoppers pausing to watch street performers, the Loop was filled with business people. I deliberately took a long time finding my way to the Michigan Avenue Bridge and the number 6 stop. So heartening did I find it to be among people who actually lived in the city and were going about the business of daily life. I stumbled upon this most typical and obvious group of city dwellers as if it was a well-kept secret. Being in a crowd of people who belonged in Chicago and who paid me no mind because they were too busy living life gave me a needed respite from my choking solipsism. When I arrived at the bridge, I gazed up at the new Trump Tower. At the very top, where the sun struck it against the cloudless sky, a white-hot radiance reflected onto my face, forcing me to squint as I stared at the building and tried to somehow internalize its well-built structure. I wanted nothing more than to return to St. Louis, but there was a month of school left. I was tired and depressed and had few sources of comfort in my life. My grandparents were wasting away in a nursing home 300 miles to the south, and I couldn't do anything about it except to call and tell them I loved them. When I returned to campus, I saw the girl I loved sitting in the dining hall with the guy she loved, and it seemed another sign that this was a lost year. But at that moment along the river, I knew there was a way out of my depression. I saw how a summer at home could burn away my sickness like a fog and restore my faith in people, in literature, and going about my business. And I knew that somewhere, perhaps not on this bridge, but somewhere, lay Chicago's heart. I thought I had been searching for it all year, but that had been little more than manic gesture. I understood on the bridge that I had been looking in all the wrong places. When my family came to get me in June, they asked if I wanted to hang around Chicago for a few days and sightsee. I said absolutely not. So we'll do more of an evacuation of Saigon type thing, my dad said. Exactly. I left without saying goodbye to many people, feeling relieved as my dad and I headed out of Chicago and into the fields of Illinois, my mom and sister staying behind to explore the city I was feeling. Thoughts of summer and of transferring schools next winter filled my head. And indeed, the summer did in some ways make me whole again. It wasn't without its pain. A general anxiety still hung over my family. I couldn't stand to be around my sister, and worse, I couldn't explain why. But being in St. Louis gave me an underlying stability, and gradually I didn't feel so spread out, though I dreaded returning to Chicago. But when I arrived this September, the change was total and immediate. Friends awaited me with hugs and handshakes. I was eager to enter a classroom. Whatever seed was planted in me that afternoon on the Michigan Bridge blossomed upon my return. My grandparents' health has further deteriorated, and I found that their decline has provoked in me, paradoxically, a new exaltation in my youth. I bound up stairs and stride across streets. I enjoy talking to pretty girls, fancying how my grandfather would have bantered much the same way in his Navy days during World War II. The pleasure I take in such reveling at first produced a sort of survivor's guilt. Their world had been irrevocably shrunken, while mine grew every day. I felt a pang of this when I said goodbye to my grandma at the end of September. I was stricken with the thought that this could be the last time I would ever see her, that after 20 years of knowing each other, we just wouldn't. I didn't like the thought of my life's vector continuing upwards, while hers diverged and ultimately stopped. But I soon remembered a line from a Mary Oliver poem, quoted by my high school English teacher when telling me to let college unfold in its own way. When it's time to let go, let go. This is what I had forgotten during my first year in Chicago, that there are ends to things. When I spoke with my grandmother last year, and she would tell me how much pain she was in, or how depressing it was to see all her life's possessions disappear, I didn't know what to say, but I didn't realize that this was because there was nothing to say, nothing except I love you, and to leave it at that. I didn't realize that the sickness that accompanies life does not come with a remedy, but only an imperative to move forward. Like my hometown, I'm disposed to wonder about what might have been. What if I had gotten into Columbia? What if Grandpa hadn't had a stroke? What if I was still in high school? But one can't keep all roads open all of the time. The search for the center will not allow it. Thank you.
Very quickly, before I introduce our final reader for the evening, I want to say, again, thank you all for coming out tonight. When we're done with the reading, there's also a reception, so we have some light refreshments as well as beverages here. We welcome you to enjoy those. And then I also want to encourage everybody here, if you haven't been or if you have, to take a walk through the galleries and look at the Heartland exhibit. You'll get a whole another set of visions of what the Heartland, the center of this country, is and might mean from a broad variety of really fascinating artists. So please consider doing that. Our final reader tonight, the winner of the first prize in the prose category for the Heart of Chicago Writing Contest, is Michael Carwile. Michael Carwile is the third year in the college, majoring in linguistics. Michael grew up in Haddonfield, New Jersey, where one summer his work at a local history museum spurred his interest in peculiarities and individual stories of otherwise overlooked places. He was drawn to the University of Chicago because of its location in Chicago, and since coming here, his main hobby has been visiting out-of-the-way places in the neighborhoods of the city and its satellite communities. In addition to the places recounted in his winning piece, he has been to the burial plot of the world's first nuclear waste, ours. That's exciting. The town that served as Punxsutawney in the movie Groundhog Day, and 3 out of 5 of the windmills in the state of Illinois. Anyone want to drive out to Golden, Illinois and make it 4 out of 5? I'm pleased to welcome Michael Carwile, reading from For the Second Windy City of Big Shoulders That Works in a Garden.
So here we go. The second windy city of big shoulders that works in a garden. The heart of Chicago is probably not in Hutch. Grand as that vaulting Gothic ceiling is as it spans over painted academics looking spiffy in their gowns, I'm skeptical. An all-American metropolis does not need some Oxford transplant to keep its heart in. Or if it is, then we really went out of our way that Sunday night. Sam and James and I were sitting there at one of the long tables in the semi-darkness, poring over a map of Chicago. The idea was to plan a bus tour of this city of ours, spread out before us like a Ouija board, an idea that later only sort of got off the ground. From the urban sociology class in which we met, we were charmed by the great expanse of the city, seeing in its broad contours the possibility of narrow crevices, where perhaps we could sink below the skin of the beast and see its organs at work. But where to start? Hegewisch. James's finger fell on that neighborhood, neatly tucked into the exact southeastern corner of the city. It's miles from the nearest L stop. The metro doesn't even stop in Hegewisch. Chicago's Easter Island, maybe you could call it. The exotic lure of the neighborhood, populated by giants or Amazons or who knows what, was irresistible. So that very night we set out. So much for planning. The thrill comes in the plunge into uncharted waters. But a plunge such as ours would require wheels, and thankfully Sam had a car. We climbed the Chicago Skyway and began to retrace the trek my mom had made with me on the way to school for the first time. But we didn't make it nearly as far as New Jersey, turning off instead at the east side of Chicago. The East Side, it sounds like a fantasy, as strange a concept as a West Dakota or the Flemish Alps, but it does exist. But when that British pop group sang about Al Capone and the lawmen battling it out on the East Side, they probably weren't really thinking of this quiet, out-of-the-way neighborhood. Hegewisch, even more so than East Side, felt a world away from the bustle of the city. There are only 3 roads leading in from the rest of Chicago. The remainder of the boundary is brownfield, marshland, and industrial property. We parked and walked what felt like the downtown strip of a small Midwestern town. If it was 20 miles from the Loop, it could have been 100, not the kind of place to be awake on a Sunday night. There were 2 businesses with the lights on, a bar and a pizza joint, and only one of them were we legal for. Pudgy's Pizza is the kind of place with a yellowing tin ceiling and walls covered in pictures of Little League teams, some over a decade old, each thanking Pudgy for his sponsorship. It's an intimate place. It has only 1 table. And when we opened the door, we felt we were greeted as if we'd walked into somebody's kitchen, which I suppose we had. We asked our host what he'd recommend, and what we got was the Bob's Mistake. We were intrigued. The mistake, if you can call it that, is combining sausage, garlic, fresh tomatoes, and red and green peppers, and Bob, well, is Pudgy before he became Pudgy. Our host has been in the pizza business over 30 years now, and while he now looks the part, he wasn't the first Pudgy. He inherited the name from his predecessor. He made his first pizza in Vietnam, and coming home, he found a job in the steel mills, like everybody else. But he wasn't made for steel making, it seems, and not long after coming back, he took up delivering pizzas, worked his way up to owning the place, and works there still today, while the steel mills are shuttered or scrapped. He makes a mean pizza. Police sirens sounded out front and then kept sounding. After a while, 2 police officers came in a sour mood. Pudgy put a pizza in for them and they shared their frustration. They evidently knew Pudgy pretty well. This wasn't the first incident across the street. Public housing, that was the problem. Folks don't know how to keep a household. The neighborhood ain't what it used to be, and the rest of that song. I don't know what we found that Sunday night. We agreed that Hegewisch wasn't quite the place to dig and strike to Chicago, but maybe we were onto something nonetheless. Steel mills loomed in the darkness over Hegewisch. By day, we would have seen them gone, but by night, we could imagine great glinting behemoths, all girders and smokestacks, exhaling their balmy, noxious breath into the air. Do such things linger on beyond their natural lifespans? Perhaps as heroes, memorialized in song. As boogeymen of the New Order, perhaps, or perhaps as watchmaker gods, powerful even in their absence. I don't know. Does the past still beat, and does the present step in time? Stephanie and I once found ourselves at a loss on a one-way causeway in the marshes, not a mile from the former Acme Steel coke plant. We weren't alone. In fact, there was a bus full of us, all eager to see the remains of our city's industrial southeast. But it was not to be, with our bus stopped in the face of a passing train and our tour guide left with nothing to do but tell us stories of home. Stephanie and I listened attentively, and Stephanie even took some notes, but I couldn't begin to retell any of his stories now, for by my reckoning, he began all of them midway through. He talked about the brother of Eddie Verdoliak, or Bernoliak, or what I couldn't tell, I'd never heard of the man whose brother meant nothing to me. But the way he brought him up, without introduction, with a mixture of contempt and reverence, he must have been big stuff. There was John Cass, who did something important somewhere. There was Bobby Franks, found in a drainage ditch. And then there was the infamous Richard Speck, who committed unspeakable acts. True to his word, the tour guide never told us what he'd done. Not that the rest of the bus needed to be told. As Stephanie and I sat there in confusion, our fellow passengers goaded him on. Tell us about this guy and that one. Stories they wanted to hear, not because they were new to them, but because they knew them and knew they were worth telling. The train passed eventually, and the bus got moving. We pulled up in front of the old Acme plant, or what was left of it, and it turns out we were visiting a museum that never was to be. The group running these tours had wanted to turn the abandoned plant into a steel museum, but they could never secure the funds or the city's approval. Already their would-be museum was being dismantled, towed away, and sold for scrap. The tour guide passed the plans about. There was going to be interactive exhibits, a children's section. Instead, we got to see through green mesh and chain-link fencing where until recently had stood the last blast furnace in the city of Chicago, whatever a blast furnace is. One last time I rode through this section of the city by bike. It's amazing how expansive it is, a wilderness almost, now that so much industry is left. I rode by huge, hulking, rusting, tottering monstrosities, more gargantuan machines than buildings, and I could not fathom how they might once have worked. Might once have worked when they weren't hidden in tall grasses, when there weren't trees growing through their collapsed roofs. An article for Chicago Wilderness Magazine, yes, there is a Chicago Wilderness Magazine, once compared the experience to coming across Mayan temples in the jungles of Belize. Dense vegetation and denser swarms of mosquitoes giving way to the vast, majestic, and bewildering remains of the ancients. Well, I rode through an early spring, a time that is warm but not green, so it didn't quite have this effect on me. But there were factories that looked like castles on the bluffs and deer on the Cal-Sag Channel. There's a monastery at 31st and Aberdeen. Bridgeport is no wasteland of sludge and blast furnaces, but the monks too see in their city a wilderness, and they are the voice crying out in it. They cry out 8 times a day: vigils, lauds, terce, sext, none, vespers, compline, and the Mass, all in the Gregorian mode, open to all who wish to join them. Yet when Stephanie, Anna, James, and I arrived one day to hear them, or to worship, I don't know, we found their open doors to be very much only a metaphor. After much anxious waiting on the street, studying the front of the church, and hoping we had remembered the time correctly, did we finally pick up a faint Gregorian echo, barely noticeable under the din of traffic. I doubt anyone just walking by outside would have noticed, and inside we had our pick of seats. We were the only ones there. All alone, we couldn't help but make a scene in our entrance, but the monks went on in their steady worship. Even James's coughing fit could not disturb them. Their trance fell upon us, or upon me at least. These men were mediocre vocalists, but, it seems, listening to the warbled strains of their earnest appeal to the divine, superior monastics. I would have liked to ask them about their mission in this city of ours, a desert, so their website says, of alienation, poverty, and noise, a desert in which they witness the power of God by a life of community, simplicity, prayer, and silence. But the chanting did not stop until the last monk had turned off the lights and left the hall of the church, leaving us alone, in contemplation, and in the city of Chicago. For what it's worth, the monk's webpage begins with the heading, "In the Heart of the City." There's another monastery in the city. There are probably many more, but there's another I've run into. While the monks of the Holy Cross in Bridgeport fulfill their worldly service in part by digitizing library catalogs, the Marian Fathers of Westlawn are firmly entrenched in the world of ink and paper. Among the buildings on their grounds, a handsome, low-lying mid-century complex, is the publishing house of the world's oldest Lithuanian newspaper, the only Lithuanian daily published outside of Lithuania. When I learned of this institution, tucked incongruously between a 7-Eleven and Midway Airport, I just had to see it for myself. And when I got to the front of the line inside, the woman at the counter addressed me in Lithuanian. I can safely say I never expected to be addressed in Lithuanian on the 87th Meridian West in 2008, but I never expected to be buying a Lithuanian paper either. Its pages were no more comprehensible than the saleslady's questions, but but it must have been a slow day for the Lithuanian diaspora. There was white space on the front page. Draugas, so the paper is named, does not stand alone, but is part of Lithuanian archipelago in West Lawn and Marquette Park, the highest mountaintops of a now submerged continent. At 65th and Pulaski, you'll find the Belzakas Museum of Lithuanian Culture, complete with a suit of armor, a chunk of amber, and tranquility approaching monastic levels. When I was there, the only other visitor, if you can call him that, was a man who thought the museum was an early voting station. In a corner of Marquette Park, there's a monument to the flight of the Lituanica, erected by Chicago's Lithuanian community in memory of their two sons who, in 1933, would have completed one of the longest nonstop flights of their age, but for a crash just miles from the Lithuanian border. Along the park, Draugas peeks out of mailboxes, and the signs of Holy Cross Hospital affirm in 3 languages: yes, si, and the last, probably gibberish to most passersby, the Lithuanian type. As I walked up to Seklitsia on 71st Street, the restaurant looked as if it had succumbed to the fate of most other Lithuanian businesses in the area. Only right in front of the door could I see through the blinds the lights on and the waitress scooting about. The place was nearly full. It doesn't take too many to fill 6 tables. And once again, everyone was speaking Lithuanian. They all had gray hair, too. Not a Lithuanian I saw that day didn't. It was as if they weren't making them anymore. The sign above the door reads Seklitsia, Lithuanian Human Services. But as far as I could tell, the only human service provided was nourishment. And how was that? What can I say? This was the sort of place where people come day after day to eat the food they've eaten every day of their lives, not for a culinary experience. But if you do want to try Lithuanian food, I'd recommend Healthy Food on 32nd and Halstead. Like Seklitsia, the name is misleading. Maybe this is a thing with Lithuanian restaurants? The first item on the menu is boiled meat dumplings served with bacon bits and sour cream. But the name is more to evoke Grandma's kitchen than rabbit food, and the warm, worn decor does the same. Sam and I first ended up at Healthy Food coming home from the Washburn Trade School, which is a story in itself, if you'll bear with me. When we showed up at a Dunkin' Donuts parking lot at 9 a.m. on a Saturday, we weren't quite sure what to expect, and we weren't quite sure we weren't the only ones there for reasons beyond the bagels and coffee. Then the boots started showing up. The people attached to the feet they showed up on were different enough, but the boots were all the same: sturdy, dusty, and inconvenient for city living. The Washburn Trade School hasn't been in session since 1996, and in its afterlife, it had become the Ellis Island for Chicago urban exploration, the preferred euphemism, of course, for gaining unlawful access to abandoned buildings. Most of our fellow explorers were newcomers to the art. A few were seasoned anti-establishment types who roamed the country looking for these kind of places. Most introduced themselves as amateur photographers, which Sam says is the preferred euphemism for people who have bought expensive cameras. The school is gone now, to be turned into a park, hopefully. But on that May morning, it stared us down from across the street as we kicked around in the parking lot, hoping our guide would soon show up. She did, eventually, and perfunctorily performed her single duty beyond posting the invitation on meetup.com, show us the hole in the fence and wish us luck. Beyond that, there was no guidance. Once inside the grounds, we were on our own. And because the grounds were so sprawling and the buildings so huge, I mean this literally, Sam and I could go for half an hour at a time without running into our fellow explorers. I can appreciate why an activity such as this would be discouraged by law. Despite our appearance as a group, if one of us was to fall through any of the many gaping holes in the wall, none of the rest would have noticed. There was no counting off, no buddy system. The semblance of an organized activity was merely a crutch for those of us too nervous to take the plunge into criminal trespassing alone. The building was cavernous now that it had been mostly stripped bare. It was never exactly hard to get into, and it looked as if scavengers had carted off anything of value and taggers had graffitied the rest. This was a boon to the photographers, who could now take long, wistful shots of urban decay down the abandoned corridors. Perhaps it was cavernous even before. I cannot imagine a school at this scale, 4 floors each 2/3 of a mile in length. Despite the overturned desks and piles of textbooks, among all the old technical manuals for welding, electrical engineering, and auto repair, I found a single book called Adventures in Reading. Without the students, the building felt very much like the factory it was before being converted into a trade school. In 1910, it was born in the prairie style and christened a liquid carbonic factory. In 2010, it may well be playing fields. Over Blinai back at Healthy Food, Sam and I recounted the thrill of our expedition, infiltrating and escaping unscathed from the jaws of that whale beached on Kedzie. The Lithuanian women who worked the place came over to listen, and they were sorry to hear that the school had closed. From dances in their youth, they remembered the boys of Washburn fondly. We got to talking about the restaurant, about Lithuania, about the Chicago of their youth and ours. "Where are the two of you from?" one asked. We told her we were students at the university in Hyde Park. "But where are you from?" "New York and New Jersey," we told her. "Yes, but what countries?" The question pressing on the mind of the proprietor of a Lithuanian restaurant half a world away from Lithuania was for us an issue over 3 generations removed, and we didn't quite know what to say. There was one other time I made my way into an abandoned factory, though under circumstances different enough that I feel somewhat more justified. The Pullman factory at 111th and Cottage Grove was a great big enigma the first time I shot past it by Metro. I had been lulled into a false sense of Chicago. Block after block of brick 4-stories, then bungalows, a church here and a school there, commercial strips at regular intervals, small vignettes watchable in the span of time it takes a speeding train to pass. Then, before I knew it, this great big enigma was staring back at me, already receding from view before I could make sense of it. It's an uppity number, awash with cascading brick arches and trick chimneys, fitted under a mansard roof and crowned with a lonely clock tower, altogether too fancy for the southern marches of the city. And that clock tower definitely stares at the railroad tracks, which is almost like staring at a blank wall, except a blank wall is at least quiet. Was it a railroad station? Not anymore, it certainly wasn't. A museum, a mansion, a Masonic temple? It looked half burnt out, half brand new, completely vacant, and completely out of place in the ecology of Chicago. An alien species that just couldn't quite cut it. It makes more sense in context. As Sam, Hannah, Michelle, and I saw that day we biked down Cottage Grove, the whole of the neighborhood of Pullman is a 3/4 scale confection of brick and wrought iron. But even in context, the factory building stands apart. Back in the day, they made railroad cars here, and over a trim lawn and reflecting pool, the factory would watch trains clank by like a mother hen. Now, while each of the pint-sized Pullman row homes shows off its neatly tended front garden and litter of flower boxes, the factory's front yard is all patches, alternately wildflowers and concrete, contained within a rent-a-fence. Hardly inviting, but the fence was open. We cautiously stepped inside, and our doubts were confirmed almost immediately when a woman walked up to us and made us known that the factory was state property, all tours must be made in advance, no one was to be admitted outside a guided tour. Then, almost as an afterthought, as we had turned away and were about to cross the street, she said, "But the manager is here today. He might like to show you around. Look for John." Boy, did John like showing us around. He was a youngish man, clean-cut but somewhat wild-eyed, on his knees gardening when we found him, but he dropped everything and with a quick step drew us toward the building. "I shouldn't be letting you inside," he said as he unlocked the front door. "I shouldn't be taking you upstairs," he said, and soon we were looking out the second-story windows. The effect of passing through those doors was like walking behind a movie set, for what lay in back looked more like a parking garage than any 19th century factory. John explained this. He explained everything, weaving together the stories of the neighborhood, one industrialist's dream to build a model city and the strike that showed his folly, of his own work, and of the afterlife of the building, passing from hand to hand of ever more marginal industries until it was utterly outmoded and left for dead. Then the bums came, and then the fire. The bums saved this building, John said. The state had acquired it as an historic property, but the funds for renovation were slow coming, while the factory was rotting into the soil. Then some crazy set the thing ablaze, and the state had a public safety hazard on its hands. It had to send in a team to reinforce the building, keep it from collapsing at any moment, and thus the vacant, modern interior. John wasn't complaining. There's no point in dressing it up like it's 1885. This is the 21st century. This is a 21st century with 130-year-long roots. What's fascinating is how these buildings, these neighborhoods age, he said. He secretly hopes the state never opens the building to tourists, that they never have to haul in period furniture, that he never has to memorize a script. I asked him what he envisions for the building, and he says it hardly matters, because the state will never put up the money. He told about the ordeal of working with bureaucracy, and he told his own story. John was in insurance before historic preservation, but just before insurance was about to eat his soul, he found an abandoned factory to invest it in. He told of his exploits. When factories go under, he goes in and secures the relics. He's a pack rat at heart. And he showed us his collection, his hoard. Hard hats, typewritten documents, a load of black metal machine parts I couldn't begin to imagine the function of. You see that thing in the yard, he said, as he pointed to a cone about as wide as it was tall and as tall as I was? That's the cap to the last blast furnace in the city of Chicago. That bus tour eventually came together. In a form so altered it no longer needed a bus. There were only 3 of us. Sam's car brought us far from the rusting refuse of the city's underside to a shiny tower in the West Loop, where, after a number of security checks, we sat down with 3 executives of the Boeing company to discuss the city of ours. The Pullman factory closed down in 1982. U.S. Steel packed up in 1992. The Washburn Trade School let out in 1996. Boeing moved its corporate headquarters to Chicago in 2001. The execs chided us some for showing up too late and too few, but I'd like to think they preferred sitting down to talk with 3 students than lecturing 15. Unlike about us, they had only positive things to say on Chicago. A global city befitting a global corporation, a centralized corporate services sector, municipal government that gets things done, even if what they praised others would have criticized as heavy-handed. No, I don't think the heart of Chicago is in some glass box in the Loop. It's no more likely a transplant from Seattle than from Oxford. But I'm certain the same blood pumps into those climate-controlled conference rooms as into Pudgy's tin-ceiling kitchen. Yes, Chicago is a factory town. Rail and steel and sweat are written indelibly into its face, and it's a factory town being colonized by corporate aerospace. John was right, and not just about Pullman. Relics, too, have a presence. Boeing moved to Chicago because it was a world-class city. And how do you think it got that way? Certainly not by sitting pretty on the lake.
I want to thank everyone for coming again, and if we can congratulate our winners and thank them for sharing what they see as Chicago's heart. So give them a round of applause, please.